Under the gray morning sky of a quiet suburb on the edge of the city, Monica Halls pushed open the creaking gate to her small but well-kept yard. The house in front of her was a modest two-story structure, nothing grandiose, but every inch of it had been shaped by her hands. After years of renting and working in shared studio spaces, she'd finally saved enough to buy her own place, a space that wasn't just a roof over her head, but a reflection of who she was. She had spent months restoring it, balancing her work as a vintage furniture restorer with endless paint fumes, cracked plaster, and hours sanding old floors. But the most meaningful piece of the home, without question, was the antique front door. A thick, restored oak structure with a faded brass knocker and a vertical strip of stained glass in muted blues and greens. The door had been a gift from her late mother, a fiercely independent woman who ran an antique store in a nearby town. It had taken Monica weeks to refurbish the door to its current state, and when she finally installed it, with its imperfections intact, it felt like her home had taken a deep breath and settled into itself. Monica didn't know many of the neighbors by name yet. She kept to herself, for the most part, balancing her time between commissions, client meetings, and the quiet meditative work of polishing, varnishing, and sketching new restoration ideas in her basement studio. Occasionally, she'd wave to people walking their dogs or nod politely at the few who mowed their lawns in perfect diagonals. One neighbor in particular, a sharp-voiced woman named Karen Sloan, had approached her early on, within days of Monica moving in, and commented that the house had potential, if only it followed the neighborhood's visual guidelines. Monica hadn't thought much of it at the time. She had nodded, thanked her for the advice, and moved on with her day. But Karen's presence never quite faded into the background. She seemed to watch everything from her large bay window across the street, often seen whispering with another committee member or jotting something in a notebook. Monica had no reason to fear her, but she could never quite shake the sensation of being monitored. Despite the subtle tension, Monica didn't involve herself in neighborhood politics or the local housing committee's meetings. She had no reason to. Her yard was clean, the garbage bins placed properly, and she had even repainted the shutters in a color listed in the community's palette guidelines, which she had taken the time to download and study carefully. Her renovations had all been above board. She had permits for the electrical work, approvals for the fence line restoration, and her contractor had assured her that the door, while antique and certainly unique, did not violate any safety or visibility codes. Monica valued harmony, not attention. Still, the house wasn't just compliance to her, it was expression, history, and memory carved into wood and glass. On this particular morning, however, something felt off before she even reached the steps. A chill ran through her that wasn't from the wind. Her eyes locked onto the front of the house. Something was wrong. The textures, the symmetry, something had changed. And then she saw it. The door was gone. Her heart stopped as she stumbled up the path, not quite believing her eyes. The antique oak door had been replaced by a plain, brushed metal placeholder. It looked like something taken from the back of a warehouse or the entrance to a utility closet. Sterile, soulless, and completely foreign to her home's aesthetic. The temporary installation had been haphazardly sealed with expanding foam insulation around the edges, still tacky in spots, with flecks of dust clinging to it like ash. It wasn't just ugly, it was a violation. Monica's breath came short as she reached for the metal handle and found it cold and unfamiliar. The door creaked inward. She stepped inside, not knowing whether to expect chaos or emptiness, but the interior was untouched. No signs of forced entry, no mess, no indication of a break-in, just that brutal, jarring absence where her door had once stood. Near her feet, half tucked under the new frame, was a paper, standard white, typed, sealed in a plastic sleeve. She picked it up and read the words in mechanical disbelief. Notice of compliance action. Your front entryway has been found in violation of visual conformity standards. Rectification has been completed by the Neighborhood Aesthetic Committee. There was no signature, no phone number, no warning. Just a statement of action, as if her property, her memory, and her choices were nothing more than a line item in someone's spreadsheet. She stood there for a long time, the cold wind creeping through the gaps around the door, the sound of a distant lawnmower buzzing in the distance, and all she could feel was the echoing stillness where something precious had been stripped away, without her knowledge, without her consent, and without even the decency of a conversation. The hours that followed moved in a blur, as if Monica were wading through a thick, invisible fog. Every logical part of her brain wanted to believe there had been a mistake, an address error, a misfiled permit, a rogue contractor who was supposed to replace a different door on a different house. But as she sat on the edge of the bottom stair, gripping the printed notice in her hand, the words didn't change. The phrasing was clinical, devoid of apology, and disturbingly firm in its finality. The action had already been taken. There was no suggestion of appeal, no acknowledgement that it was her property, her decision, or even her right to be consulted. She ran her fingers along the coarse metal edge of the new door, the way someone might test the bark of a felled tree, searching for some sign it might still be alive underneath. Without thinking, she opened the Contacts app on her phone and scrolled to the number of Officer Dale Kenner, the local beat cop who had once helped her with a noise complaint during nearby construction. He had been friendly, respectful, and thorough, someone who still seemed to believe in doing things by the book. She wasn't calling 911. She wasn't in danger. But she needed someone official, someone neutral, to see this with her eyes. When he answered, she heard the faint hum of his patrol car's engine. She explained the situation as calmly as she could, her voice betraying none of the fury building just beneath the surface. He agreed to stop by in the next half hour, intrigued and clearly puzzled by her account. While she waited, Monica stepped outside and stood on the porch, staring at the quiet street that had always felt so benign. Everything looked the same. There were sprinklers clicking methodically on freshly watered lawns, a kid on a scooter turning a corner, the faint trill of a wind chime from a house down the block. But now, the street felt colder, narrower, as if the neighborhood itself had shifted its posture into something quietly hostile. She caught sight of Karen Sloan watching from across the road, partially obscured by a lace curtain. Their eyes met for a second. Karen didn't flinch or pretend she hadn't been staring. She simply tilted her head, pursed her lips into a tight line, and then disappeared from view. When Officer Kenner arrived, he pulled up slowly, already scanning the property before he stepped out. Monica greeted him with a restrained nod and led him directly to the front door, explaining again everything she knew, which was, in truth, alarmingly little. He inspected the frame carefully, his trained eye taking in the foam sealant, the scratched hardware, the mismatched hinges. He asked if she had given anyone permission to enter or make modifications to the property. She shook her head with quiet intensity. He crouched to examine the base of the door, where one of the original screw holes had been left exposed and unfilled, as if whoever had removed her door hadn't cared enough to hide the evidence. "This wasn't done by a city worker," he finally said. "There's no inspection notice, no city seal. Whoever did this acted on their own authority." Monica felt her throat tighten. But on whose authority? It says the Neighborhood Aesthetic Committee. That's not even a legal entity, is it? Kenner raised an eyebrow. Not in the way law enforcement is. They're a volunteer board. They have influence, sure, but only within whatever powers the neighborhood agreement gives them. They don't get to alter someone's property without due process. He took out his phone and photographed everything. Door, notice, frame, even the latch. He promised to file an incident report and forward it to both City Code Enforcement and the Housing Department for review. Monica thanked him, not because she felt comforted, but because it was the only response she could muster that didn't involve breaking something. He left her with a simple suggestion. Install a temporary lock immediately and do not leave the house unattended until this was resolved. That afternoon, Monica called a local handyman she had worked with before, Joel, a soft-spoken but meticulous craftsman who helped her with her back gate the previous year. She explained the situation, and though clearly surprised, he arrived within an hour with a spare wooden door in tow and installed it with quiet efficiency. The temporary door was plain, but it was solid. He left her with a new lock, 2 keys, and a hesitant, almost embarrassed glance. "This kind of thing shouldn't be happening," he said. "Not without your say." Monica nodded, exhausted but far from finished. She sat down at her kitchen table that night and began pulling out folders from the side cabinet. Property documents, receipts, photos of the original door from before and after installation, permit approvals, and printouts of the housing regulations. She'd so carefully followed when moving in. She opened her laptop and began a file labeled Incident. Front door, methodically scanning everything into a digital archive. She wasn't going to spiral. She wasn't going to panic. But she also wasn't going to let this go. Her research led her to the neighborhood's official website. A clunky interface with a private login required to access community notices, minutes from meetings, and compliance requests. She tried to log in using the credentials she had set up months ago. Access denied. She tried the password reset feature. Email not recognized. Confused, she searched her inbox and found the original welcome message from the neighborhood board, complete with her user ID. It was still the same email, still the same address, still her account, and yet locked out. She submitted a request to the site administrator, attaching a copy of her property deed and asking to restore her access. Within 10 minutes, she received a cold, templated response. Per request of the board, access to owner accounts is currently restricted pending verification review. You will be notified when reinstatement is approved. That night, she barely slept. She paced the kitchen in silence, listening to the creaks of her house settling, imagining someone standing at the door again in the dead of night, drill in hand, removing another piece of her life without permission. It wasn't just the door, it was the erasure of her voice, the silent dismissal of her right to exist in her own home without interference. The following morning, her mailbox contained a second notice, this time in a sealed envelope stamped with the neighborhood committee's letterhead. Inside was a printed form with clipped language explaining that her recent modifications had been flagged for review and that she had failed to submit required visual conformity documents before the deadline. The letter stated that her appeal window had lapsed and that, under the guidelines, restorative action had been taken. Again, no names, no signatures, no time-stamped communication history, just a verdict. Monica sat on the porch, the envelope still in her lap, her hands trembling in frustration. She wasn't just being gaslit, she was being procedurally erased. Someone, somewhere, had made a decision about her home, executed it without consulting her, and was now pretending the process had been fair. But she knew better. She had the permits, she had the emails, she had the timeline. What she didn't have was access, power, or allies. That would have to change. She opened her laptop again and began making a list, not of people she wanted to confront, but of things she needed to understand. Who approved these actions? Who enforced them? Who profited from them? Why now and why her? And who exactly decided she didn't belong? As the neighborhood basked in the comfort of sameness, Monica began preparing for war. Not with rage or chaos, but with receipts, patience, and an unshakable refusal to be pushed out of the home she had built with her own hands. And while the rest of the block watered their lawns and nodded politely at Karen Sloan, Monica was already making quiet, deliberate moves to expose the cracks in the porcelain facade they were all so desperate to preserve. Monica had always believed that bureaucracy, while tedious and often frustrating, at least played by a set of rules. She had never been naive enough to think those rules were always fair, but she counted on them to be legible, to have boundaries, structure, some kind of traceable logic. But, over the next week, as she began attempting to untangle the twisted mess of what had happened to her door, she came face to face with a system that operated in silence and shadows. The neighborhood committee, which had once seemed like a trivial group of retirees who obsessed over lawn heights and holiday lights, was now something else entirely. Tightly guarded, evasive, and increasingly hostile to scrutiny. Her first step was to request a formal meeting. She emailed the listed contact for the Architectural Oversight Subcommittee, a generic Gmail account shared among its members, and requested copies of the meeting minutes where her property had allegedly been discussed. She was polite, firm, and attached proof of ownership, her building permit for the door installation, and a scanned photo of the door itself. She even included a short paragraph explaining the sentimental value of the door, hoping to appeal to a sense of basic decency. 3 days passed without response. Then, on Thursday afternoon, she received a letter in her mailbox. It wasn't from the city, nor did it carry any legal insignia. It was a sealed envelope on heavy beige cardstock, her name handwritten across the front in perfect cursive. Inside was a single sheet of paper with centered text in serif font. Your request for access to internal records has been denied. Discussions regarding your property were conducted under special session protocols. As such, records are not subject to general homeowner review. Please refrain from contacting subcommittee members directly. Any further inquiries must be submitted through the approved dispute channel. Non-compliance may result in further administrative action. There was no name, no signature, no point of contact. Monica stared at the paper for a long time, her fingers clenching it so tightly that the edges curled inward. Special session protocols. Dispute channel. The language wasn't just cold, it was manufactured to intimidate, to distance her from the source of power, and to remind her, very clearly, that she was not part of the inner circle. Unwilling to wait for a channel that clearly didn't exist, she made a decision. She would attend the next committee meeting in person. According to the public schedule still posted on the Neighborhood Bulletin Board website, meetings were held every other Tuesday in the small, sterile community room attached to the local library branch. It wasn't far, a 15-minute walk, which she made just before sunset, her binder of documents tucked under her arm like armor. The room was lit by fluorescent bulbs and arranged with plastic folding chairs in neat rows facing a long table with a few microphones and pitchers of water. Monica arrived early. She sat quietly and watched as residents trickled in, some chatting idly, others clutching copies of neighborhood newsletters or compliance updates. At exactly 6 o'clock, the members of the committee entered as a group, all wearing matching navy blue name tags. Karen Sloan was among them, her lipstick perfect, her smile unwavering. She spotted Monica instantly and offered a tight professional nod, as if she were greeting a stranger at a funeral. The meeting began with rote announcements, budget surplus updates, a reminder about seasonal decorations, the upcoming street paving schedule. Monica waited and waited. Finally, during the open floor segment at the end of the hour, she stood and approached the microphone. Her voice was clear and composed. She outlined the facts, that her front door had been forcibly removed without notice or legal authorization, that she had been locked out of the community portal, that she had received no warnings or citations beforehand, and that she had received only anonymous, unsigned documents after the fact. She requested an explanation, a record of the vote, and the name of the party who authorized entry onto her property. The response was immediate and carefully rehearsed. The chairman, a man named Russell Blaine with a voice like dry gravel, adjusted his glasses and leaned toward the mic. Ms. Howells, thank you for your comments. We understand this has been an upsetting experience. However, the board acted in accordance with Section 12B of the Neighborhood Visual Continuity Guidelines. These guidelines were voted into effect in January and allow for intervention when non-compliant elements are installed without appropriate aesthetic review. Monica raised her hand again. My door wasn't non-compliant. I had permits. It was safe. And no one notified me. Who authorized the removal? Russell smiled without warmth. As you've been informed, the Architectural Subcommittee convened in special session. The vote was held in closed review. The details of that process are confidential to protect committee deliberations and avoid undue community pressure on volunteer members. If you wish to pursue the matter further, you may submit a formal variance request, which will be reviewed within the next 2 quarters. 2 quarters, 6 months. Monica's mouth opened, then closed again. Her heart was pounding. She turned to look at the audience. No one met her eyes. Not even the woman in the second row who had once asked for her help refinishing a rocking chair. Not even the old man who walked his dog past her house every morning. They were all looking at their papers, their phones, their hands, complicit through silence. Karen stood then, smooth and poised. "I'd like to add," she said, her voice syrupy, "that we received several anonymous concerns about the door. It was unfortunately disruptive to the visual rhythm of the street. We understand the emotional attachment, but rules are rules, and we must think about the neighborhood as a whole." Monica could barely breathe. She stood there for another full minute, the weight of the binder growing heavier in her hands. Then she turned, walked out of the room, and didn't look back. But the next morning, she looked deeper. In her inbox, she found an unsigned email. The address was random, clearly generated and disposable, but the message was direct. "You're not the first. If you want to understand what's really happening, check the committee's property improvement budget for the past 18 months, and look at who's been buying homes." Attached was a spreadsheet. The format was simple, but the entries were telling. Dozens of line items marked as enhancement enforcement expenditures, with vague descriptions, contractor fees, compliance audits, material disposal. Every few months, a new address appeared. Some had names she recognized, quiet residents who had quietly moved away, and always, a month or 2 later, the same addresses were linked to a company, Parkland Residential Holdings. A quick search revealed it was a limited liability corporation based just 2 counties away. Real estate acquisitions, renovations, resale. Monica dug deeper and found that Parkland had purchased at least 7 properties in the neighborhood within the past year. Every one of those homes had received some form of violation or enforcement citation within 90 days before the sale. This wasn't about visual conformity. This was about pressure, control, displacement, and now it was about Monica. The following week unfolded with a new intensity, a shift in Monica's demeanor that even she noticed when she caught her reflection in the window one morning. Something in her eyes had hardened. Not anger, not fear, but a kind of clinical focus. It was the expression of someone who had run out of disbelief, someone done waiting for apologies or explanations. The spreadsheet she'd received sat open on her laptop day and night, alongside zoning records, archived newsletters, permit databases, and corporation filings. She wasn't trying to play detective. She didn't have time for amateur sleuthing or conspiracies. What she needed was clarity and leverage, 2 things the neighborhood committee had gone to great lengths to deny her. What she wanted was accountability. The first concrete step came from outside her circle entirely. A week after the committee meeting, Monica received a call from a municipal architecture liaison named Helena Greer. She introduced herself briskly and got to the point. "We received a referral from a beat officer regarding an unauthorized structure alteration on private property. I'd like to schedule an external site visit." The appointment was set for a Wednesday morning. Helena arrived with a measuring laser, a clipboard, and a thin folder tucked under her arm. She was in her late 40s, sharp-eyed and efficient, with the quiet manner of someone used to working under pressure. She walked through Monica's house, inspected the temporary replacement door, and made careful notes. When she looked at the images Monica had printed of the original door, photos from before and after installation, she tilted her head slightly and murmured, "Well, within code. Your permits were clean." Monica handed over the stamped approval forms. Helena reviewed them, nodding slowly. Then we're looking at a procedural breach, a serious one. No warrant, no city coordination, and no record of demolition waste handling. She snapped the folder shut. You said this was done by committee order? That's what they claim. No signatures, no vote record, nothing I'm allowed to see. They've sealed it all behind special session language. Helena frowned. That's not how special sessions work. They're not exempt from procedural transparency. It sounds like someone's stretching their bylaws to dodge oversight. Monica exhaled, the pressure in her chest easing for the first time in days. She watched as Helena placed a small green sticker near the doorframe, a marker for the city's inspection department. What happens now? Helena glanced over her shoulder. I file an official violation with the county. If this committee is using enforcement as a bludgeon and coordinating unauthorized modifications, they'll be flagged. And if there's a pattern across multiple properties, it's going to draw attention. That was the word Monica had been waiting to hear. Pattern. Later that afternoon, she called Joel, the handyman who had installed her temporary door, and asked if he remembered which disposal site he used to get rid of the original. He sounded hesitant, even apologetic, when he said he hadn't handled the disposal. Was already gone when I got there. Thought you or someone else moved it. Just installed what was leaning by the side. This wasn't just procedural manipulation. It was coordinated. The door hadn't been removed and stored. It had vanished. Monica drove to the local refuse station on a hunch, showing the clerk a photo of the door. The man behind the counter was polite but firm. We don't handle private removals unless it's through a contracted bulk pickup. You got the request code? Of course she didn't, but someone had. That night, as the neighborhood slept under its identical rooflines and uniform shutters, Monica found herself unable to rest. She walked through her house, every creak in the wood floor suddenly feeling like a breach. Her home no longer felt inviolable. She turned on the outside porch light and stood behind the window, staring into the quiet. It was then she saw Karen again, this time walking not toward her own house, but across the street and into the backyard of a home that had been recently vacated. She carried nothing, said nothing, simply disappeared into the dark corner of the property. The next morning, Monica sent an email to Helena, attaching a list of the other properties mentioned in the spreadsheet. These all had violations. Then they sold. Then they were flipped. Can the city cross-reference their code enforcement history? Helena's reply was quick and direct. We can, and we will. Keep this list confidential for now. If there's financial incentive tied to property pressure, that changes the scope. Encouraged, Monica contacted an attorney. Not a personal one, not yet, but a pro bono referral from a client who had once done litigation support for small business. Disputes. The attorney's name was David Krill, and his reaction to her situation was immediate and visceral. If they entered without notice, that's trespass. If they altered or destroyed private property, that's destruction of property. If they coordinated the removal and resale without disclosure, that's civil fraud. Maybe even criminal if there's collusion with a buyer or contractor. I can't promise anything, but I can dig. David didn't ask her to make wild accusations. He asked for documents, dates, copies of emails, permit numbers. He had her build a timeline and helped her draft a preservation notice, a legal document that prevents data deletion on digital platforms in anticipation of litigation. She served it formally to the committee's generic inbox and sent a copy certified mail to their administrative address. Within 48 hours, the neighborhood website changed. The member directory disappeared. Archived meeting minutes were labeled "Currently Under Review," and the compliance portal redirected to a 404 page. By the end of the week, Monica had received a voicemail on her landline, a number only used by 3 people she trusted. The voice was male, low and calm. Ms. Hales, we understand your concern, but we encourage you to reconsider any further pursuit. This was a misunderstanding, not a personal matter. Escalation benefits no one. No threat, no name. Just the language of authority pretending to sound helpful. Monica saved the file, sent it to David, then to Helena. The next day, a certified letter arrived, this one official in format but legally toothless. The committee was initiating a formal audit of Monica's property for multiple compliance concerns, including unapproved exterior changes, unauthorized lawn signage, referring to a small no trespassing plate she'd recently installed, and noise. Disturbances related to construction activity from Joel's brief door work. It was clear retaliation. That afternoon, she visited the Public Records Office in person. The clerk at the desk helped her navigate the property transaction logs for the past 2 years. One by one, she confirmed the pattern. Properties cited. Properties fined. Properties sold. Properties flipped by the same 2 shell corporations, each connected by mailing address to Parkland Residential Holdings. One buyer was even listed under the name of the husband of a committee member. This wasn't about her door anymore. This was asset extraction disguised as community management. As Monica left the records building, her phone buzzed with a message from David. Got a hit. One of the vendors listed for your doors disposal contract appears on multiple committee invoices. He doesn't have a contractor's license in this state, but he does have a business arrangement with a demolition group tied to Parkland. We're filing preservation orders with them next. It was the middle of the afternoon, and yet Monica felt the chill of exposure settle into her bones. Someone had ripped open the facade. The architecture of compliance and community spirit had revealed its scaffolding, and underneath was profit, collusion, and a willingness to treat private homes as inventory. As the sun dipped behind the tidy homes and sterile sidewalks of her neighborhood, Monica stood on her temporary porch, eyes steady, heart slowed to the rhythm of inevitability. They had erased her door, but now she had opened one of her own, and behind it, someone was going to have to answer. The days that followed felt sharper, like the wind had changed direction. There was no immediate explosion, no confrontations in the street or fiery letters shoved under her door. Instead, the neighborhood turned colder in more subtle, insidious ways. Conversations ceased when she walked by. Neighbors who once nodded with polite detachment now turned their backs or walked briskly to their cars. The usual hollow camaraderie of trash day disappeared. No casual greetings, no shared glances across lawns. It was as if Monica had been marked, not just as a rule breaker, but as a threat to a carefully manufactured order. The irony, of course, was that she'd never been disorderly. She followed the rules more than most, filed her permits, landscaped within the set guidelines, kept noise to a minimum. What they resented wasn't behavior, it was resistance. Her attorney, David, had begun formal preparations for litigation. Not a lawsuit yet, but enough to stir fear. He filed preliminary discovery requests. He sent subpoenas to the demolition contractor listed in the payment logs. He demanded transaction histories from Parkland Residential Holdings, citing growing evidence of collusion with sitting members of the neighborhood board. At the same time, Helena from City Code Enforcement began her own administrative inquiry, compiling violations of due process and failure to file proper alteration reports. It was methodical and quiet. 2 professionals doing what Monica herself could not have done alone. She wasn't digging in basements for secret files or ambushing board members with accusations. She was documenting, escalating, and demanding answers through the right channels. And it was working. That, of course, was when the committee struck back. The first sign came in the form of a letter taped to her trash bin. Refuse not in compliance. Bin location is in violation of Section 6C2. She stared at it for a full minute before realizing that it was affixed at a precise 90-degree angle to the plastic. Clean, typed, laminated. The bin was placed exactly where it had been for the past year. No one else on the street had received a citation. She checked. The same day, a small orange flag appeared in her front yard. No note, no explanation, just a thin fiberglass rod marking some invisible infraction. Then came a noise complaint, filed anonymously, citing persistent sawing and hammering sounds at inappropriate hours. She hadn't used a power tool in over a week. David called her the next morning. "They're trying to build a record against you," he said. "A paper trail. Enough flags and they can justify escalation. Some of these boards have bylaws that allow for fines, liens, even foreclosure procedures if a homeowner is deemed chronically non-compliant." "That's insane," she replied, pacing the length of her living room. "It's rare, but not unheard of. And it's rarely about the actual violations. It's a tool. Pressure, make you sell, make you fold." Monica didn't fold. She photographed every notice, scanned every letter, and documented every time she moved her trash bin to the exact centimeter indicated by the neighborhood diagram. She printed out the sound decibel report from a noise meter app and submitted it alongside a notarized affidavit that no work had occurred at the alleged hours. Each time they came at her with bureaucracy, she responded in kind, but cleaner, sharper, and with legal backing. But the harassment wasn't just on paper. That Friday, as Monica returned from the hardware store with replacement parts for a broken window latch, she noticed that her driveway had been partially blocked by an unfamiliar car. A black SUV, tinted windows, engine running. She slowed, frowned, then carefully pulled to the side. As she stepped out of her car, the SUV slowly pulled away. No license plate, just a black rectangle where it should have been. She noted the time, the direction it turned, and called it in to Officer Kenner, who logged the incident but admitted it was difficult to act on. "Could be nothing," he said, "but keep your eyes open, and make sure your cameras are working." Monica hadn't had cameras before, but she did now. She installed them the next day, motion-activated, cloud-connected with a full panoramic view of her front entrance and driveway. Joel returned to reinforce the temporary door with a steel plate inside the frame and repositioned the hinges to prevent tampering. It felt extreme, absurd even, but as she sat on her porch that evening, staring at the empty sidewalk, she knew it wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. The neighborhood was no longer passive. It was active in its contempt. The following Monday, a woman Monica had never spoken to, an older resident with pristine flower beds and a sculpted front hedge, approached her at the mailbox and said, "You should think about whether you're really a good fit here." Then she smiled, turned and walked away. Monica said nothing. But later that night, she updated her will, photographed the entire interior of her home, and wrote a sealed letter addressed to David with a note that said, "Only open this if something happens." And then she did something none of them expected. She submitted her own violation report against the committee. Citing Helena's inspection report and David's documentation, she listed the unauthorized entry, the destruction of private property, the sealing of records in violation of state transparency statutes, and the subsequent pattern of retaliatory conduct. She didn't send it to the committee itself. She sent it to the state's Department of Consumer Affairs, which oversaw housing communities and residential boards. She attached all supporting evidence and requested an external audit under the board misconduct clause. She sent a copy to her local representative, and she made sure both Helena and David received copies. The response was faster than she expected. Within 72 hours, she received an email from the state office confirming receipt and assigning a case number. A week later, 2 agents showed up on her street, not to her door, but to the house across the road. Karen's house. They were polite, discreet, and spent 3 hours inside. When they emerged, Karen stood at the doorway with her arms crossed and jaw tight. She spotted Monica and glared, but said nothing. She knew. They all knew. That night, her inbox pinged with an anonymous email. No message, just a scanned image, an internal committee memo, watermarked and dated. It listed Monica's name under a heading titled High-Risk Properties for Acquisition Strategy. Underneath were bullet points: non-conformity, resistant, valuation limit within flip margin. At the bottom, one line stood out in bold: action required to initiate turnover. It was proof. Real, typed administrative proof that she had been targeted, not for any violation, not for any legitimate reason, but because she'd said no. Because she didn't fold. Because she had the wrong kind of door, the wrong kind of independence, and the wrong kind of silence. And now, someone had broken that silence. It was nearly 2 months to the day since Monica had returned home to find her front door replaced when the hearing date was confirmed. The letter came from the Office of Residential Oversight and was written in the same emotionless bureaucratic tone as all the others she'd received. But this time, the language worked in her favor. Preliminary evidence supports claims of procedural misconduct and unauthorized property modification. A formal hearing has been scheduled to determine administrative accountability. The document listed the committee by its legal title and named specific members as respondents. Karen Sloan's name sat third on the list. The hearing wasn't in a courthouse, not yet. It wasn't a criminal matter. But it was a state administrative procedure, and that meant sworn testimony, formal presentation of evidence, and the potential for sanctions, including dissolution of the board. Monica arrived in a charcoal gray suit with her binder tucked under her arm and David at her side. He was calm, his energy exact and measured. They didn't discuss the outcome. They didn't need to. They had the documents, the timeline, the inspection reports, and, most critically, the memo. Still unattributed, still anonymous, but now supported by months of corroborating material. The state agents had confirmed everything. A string of violations manufactured against select homeowners, followed by coordinated acquisitions by a private investment firm with ties to several sitting members of the board. What they didn't yet have was a confession, but they didn't need one. The pattern was enough. Inside the room, the board sat together at a long table, dressed not in power suits but business casual armor. Karen wore beige. Her face was tight, unmoving, like she'd been sculpted in ice. She didn't look at Monica. None of them did. They stared ahead at the administrative officer who sat behind a desk, flanked by 2 state auditors. The officer began by summarizing the allegations: unauthorized entry, destruction of private property, procedural non-compliance, retaliatory conduct, and conflict of interest through undisclosed financial relationships. Then she turned to Monica. Ms. Halls, please proceed. Monica didn't read from a speech. She spoke plainly, the way she'd rehearsed with David, but in her own words. She explained the events not as drama, but as facts. The unannounced removal of her front door, the refusal to provide documentation, the series of fabricated violation notices, the anonymous threats, the changes to the community portal, and the eventual discovery of the property acquisition records. She presented copies of everything. When she reached the memo, she paused, not for effect, but because the words still made her stomach tighten. Action required to initiate turnover, she said aloud, placing the image on the projection screen. That's not oversight, that's predation. When it was the committee's turn to respond, their attorney, a wiry man with a nasal voice, leaned hard on process. He claimed the actions were taken under a broad mandate for neighborhood cohesion, and cited ambiguous bylaw language about visual conformity and community investment strategies. He framed Monica as uncooperative and dismissive of collective values. Karen finally spoke near the end, her voice smoother than expected. She said they'd only ever wanted the best for the neighborhood, that Monica's door had been unusual and distracting, and that sometimes strong measures were required when dialogue failed. Monica watched her closely, noting the exact moment when Karen slipped when she said, "And we followed the same process we've used with other properties, which resulted in successful transitions." David's pen stopped. He underlined it. The officer caught it too. "Other properties," she repeated. "How many transitions are we referring to?" Karen froze. Their attorney shifted uncomfortably. "We'd need to check the records," he offered weakly. "You'll do more than that," the officer replied. "You'll provide full transaction history, contractor invoices, and minutes from all relevant sessions, especially the ones you previously classified as confidential." In the weeks that followed, the investigation deepened. Subpoenas were issued. Parkland Residential Holdings was named in the inquiry. Several former homeowners were contacted by the state, and their stories mirrored Monica's. Violations without warning, sudden pressure, doors removed, fences flagged, shrubs cited for obscure infractions. In one case, a homeowner's exterior light fixture had been deemed invasive and removed without permission. In another, a family was cited for their mailbox being architecturally inconsistent. Each case ended the same way, with escalating fines, isolation, and ultimately a quiet, reluctant sale. Monica didn't celebrate. She didn't post online, didn't speak to reporters when they eventually called. She kept working in her studio, restoring furniture, answering client emails, and sanding down imperfections in silence. What satisfaction she felt was cold and earned. The board was suspended pending review. Karen resigned. The house across the street went dark. The realtors stopped circling. But the door, the original, the one stolen from her, was never found. And that was what lingered. That hollow, physical absence. That proof of how easily something personal, something meaningful, could be ripped away under the guise of regulation. She ordered a replica, not perfect, but close. She stained it herself, installed it with Joel's help, and when it closed with that solid, satisfying weight, Monica didn't smile. She just turned the deadbolt, stepped back, and let silence take its place. The neighborhood moved on like it always did, slowly, impersonally, pretending nothing had ever happened. Lawns were trimmed, flags were raised, holiday decorations returned in strict adherence to seasonal schedules. But something beneath the surface had shifted, an invisible tear in the fabric of conformity that no one spoke of out loud. The board, now operating under a temporary oversight committee, stopped issuing violations entirely. Community meetings became sparse, and those who once proudly enforced rules with smiles and clipboards seemed to vanish into their garages or drive off quietly in the early mornings. Karen's house went on the market, listed under a private LLC, and offered, as is, the language cold and non-committal. No open house, no sign in the yard. It sold within weeks, but Monica never saw the buyer. She stayed. She could have left, could have sold her place now that it had become something more than a target, now that it was a symbol. But she chose not to, not out of pride or vengeance, but because it was still her home. The door, her new door, a tribute to the one taken, stood solid, reinforced with an inner steel frame but stained in the same muted tone her mother had loved. Every morning she touched it before leaving, a quiet act of reclamation. She didn't look at her neighbors anymore. She didn't wait for nods or waves. If they acknowledged her, fine. If not, better. One afternoon, she received a letter, handwritten, no return address. Inside, a single sentence. "We should have said something sooner. Thank you for not backing down." That was it. No name, no apology. But it stayed pinned to her fridge, a reminder that silence wasn't always agreement. Sometimes it was fear. Sometimes shame. And sometimes it was just people waiting for someone else to act first. In the quiet that followed, Monica got back to work. She took new commissions, taught a few workshops from her garage studio, and began restoring a long-forgotten armoire that a neighbor, one of the silent ones, had left anonymously on her porch with a note. Thought this deserved a second life. And, as the months passed, the neighborhood forgot to fear her or fight her or control her, and in that forgetting, she finally found peace.